If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers Podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Studio 26. I'm glad to have you back on the podcast today. I'm excited because today we are joined by Jon Russo. Jon, welcome to the show and give us a quick 60-second background about who you are.
Steve, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Jon Russo. Currently, I'm an agency owner, but prior to that, I have invested over 20 years of experience in B2B marketing, 10 of which have been high-tech CMO in public and private companies. And I've got a passion for helping other marketers with their journey to make sure they avoid some of the reporting landmines in particular that many of us step on. So that's a quick 60-second step of my background.
Awesome. Okay. And as our listeners know, there's not a lot of small talk at the beginning of the podcast because we jump right into case studies. Those are the most interesting things. So the first one that you're going to walk us through has to do with understanding market performance. So I'm excited to hear about this one. Take it away.
Yeah, so this particular SaaS company is a growing company, and they were really struggling with how to grow even faster, especially in a challenging economic climate. It's very similar to the one that we have now. And what they really were struggling with was trying to figure out which segments of the market were performing and why they were performing. And through a series of interactions, we helped synthesize some of their data and their processes. They had purchased a number of technologies, marketing technologies and platforms that were substandard and were not producing what they needed to produce. And by optimizing those technologies and really maximizing the investment out of that, we were able to give them the insights from those platforms. And more specifically, Steve, we provided them insights around which segments of the market were performing the best. It's commonly called tiering in our world. And we could get real granular around the tiers and the verticals that were performing, why they were performing, and so much so that the CEO of the company took a lot of interest in the insights that we were providing and ended up pivoting the company strategy around two new areas that were not a focus of the organization until we presented that data in a clear and concise way. So that would be a quick rundown of that case study.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to dive into the optimization side of it. So like you've got someone new you're working with, you're trying to figure out how you can help them. Is it a methodology that you followed, or is it, you know what, we don't know until we get in there before we start poking around and looking at what is there, what's not there? Tell me about like your day one on looking at how do you optimize?
Yeah, the great question around the optimization. The answer is yes. We do a little bit of both. Typically, it's always a good starting point in my experience to really understand the lay of the land with clients to see how they operate, how they work, how their systems work. And usually we triangulate. So there's the point of view of people and what they think is happening, the point of view of systems, and then kind of our own methodology. And rarely do all three of those connect on day one. In fact, they're usually very dispersed. And surprisingly, what to me is surprising is what we hear from companies and their leaders and their people often differs from what's actually in the systems. So day one, to answer your question, it's kind of that triangulation process. We're trying to calibrate such that those three different data points are one concentric circle by the end of the kind of conversation or engagement.
Yeah. And for this case, like when you got in there and you had access to what they had, let's just say for this case, do they have everything that they need? Is it that it's there and they just don't know how to analyze it, or it's just not robust? There's not like a central clearinghouse that gives an organization that full view of what's going on.
Yeah, in their particular case, and I would say they're probably a good majority of what we see in the market now, is the technology and the data pretty much is there.
Yep.
It may not be fully utilized to the ROI or its intended use case for a variety of different reasons. You've seen the Great Resignation, people moving in and out of organizations, business strategies change, people change, new technologies get added. So, when you add all that up, it's typically more of a case of you got a lot, but you're not using it as effectively as you could. I'd say maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 come to us and say, hey, we need some help in figuring out what else we need. But usually they're pretty good at the purchasing side. They really underestimate the process and the data side of making the optimal kind of situation to provide the right insights. It sounds really good in the sales process when they're talking to MarTech vendors that promise a lot, but then when they finally get to that destination, they make that purchase, they realize how perhaps they've underinvested in getting themselves ready for that technology.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, once the optimization happened, they pivoted and went into some new directions. Was that quick that they made that decision? And the reason I asked the question is I've seen a lot of CMOs and CEOs be very suspicious of data. Anytime there's a new take on, hey, this is giving us a different perspective, some embrace and some just go, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. So take us to that moment when they looked at the data. How did they react to it?
Yeah, this is a quick 20-ish minute podcast, and you'd think that somebody would make kind of the on-the-fly decision. It was probably the opposite of that. So leading up to that point, there was a fair amount of optimization work that we had to do with them to get the right insights to their sellers. And that optimization work would be in their CRM system, their marketing automation, their account-based platforms. These are all technologies that B2B marketers would typically use in kind of what we call a selling motion. And over time, once we got that information working well with them, we created the right reporting mechanisms. And it took some time for even our sponsor, who was the chief marketing person or the head of demand, in this case for the company, it took her some time to kind of have that confidence. And then once she started to really understand it, she was like, whoa, this is super, super powerful information that we now have. And once we got to her, we socialized it with the head of sales, and the head of sales agreed. Once we had their agreement, then the CEO started to get really interested and really involved. So it was more of a process, I think, than a destination of CEO changing the strategy on a whim. And the CEO was pretty thoughtful about it too. He, asked a lot of questions, but he too, once he saw the information, he was like, okay, well, why aren't we focusing on this segment and this segment? And ultimately pivoted the strategy because of the insights that we provided there.
Yeah. How long did it take them to get there from when you started working with them to when they went through their process and they ultimately pivoted?
Yeah, good question. In their particular case, it was probably somewhere between the 6 and 9 month marker. And that's really a function of the corporate size of an organization, kind of their current state, their future state, and that sell-in process of multiple people. So there's a lot of variables there, but in this particular case, it's about the 6 to 9 month mark.
Okay. And I imagine in that 6 to 9 month window, there has to be, I'm trying to be very dramatic because to me, I love that reveal of the data, right? And to me, there are always moments, whether you're looking at a dashboard or someone just cuts the raw data for you in Excel and shows you performance. There is that moment where it hits you in the face. And I would have to imagine, well, let me ask you the question is, do you get to those moments on a project like this? Or is it, no, you find something little and then you find something else and you have to really string together a series of different data events? How did that all unfold for you?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. Usually our process in talking with the clients, going back to your original question about the triangulation, because we're so thorough in talking with the people, looking at the systems and having our own methodology, it's typically a recommendation that has undergone a lot of scrutiny before something gets presented. So I don't want to say we've arrived at a destination like, ta-da, here's the fireworks and here you go.
Yeah.
We're battle testing along the way of the 6 to 9 months. So I may have made it sound like, hey, it's fireworks in 6 to 9 months and ta-da, look at this insight that we came up. We're pretty thoughtful. So it's a tested process that by the time we got to that destination, we had kind of shaken it out pretty well. So it's not necessarily, I don't think we met with skepticism because we had done so much diligence prior to that point. Had we not done that diligence, then I think we've opened ourselves up for that scrutiny and, kind of questioning of the data. But because we're so thorough, we didn't get a whole lot of pushback.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to jump into case study number 2. This one has to do with how you helped enhance a sales process? Always something that culturally is very difficult to do, right? Like it's very easy just to go on a whiteboard, draw something up and say, yeah, this is easy. Let's just do that, right? But culturally you're dealing with a lot of other things. So take us through this case.
Yeah, so this is a very different use case, but had a, kind of a somewhat related outcome in that it was kind of a mesh between evolutionary and revolutionary change for the sales organization, where they had a book of business that they were going after that was very focused. So a fixed number of accounts that they really wanted to penetrate. Sometimes you hear a lot of people call it account-based marketing. I hate using that term now. I think it's going to be more of an account-based sales and marketing or an account-based experience. But long story short, this organization was a very transactional organization and wanted to get more strategic and focus on more of an account-based sales approach and have marketing be on point in spearheading that initiative on behalf of sales. So I go back to the account-based experience. So our job was really to help them avoid the landmines, and we may get into this a little bit later, but we've had a lot of experience in this area of shortcutting some of the common pitfalls and problems that companies run across such that they could get to the destination quicker with their sales process and ultimately grow.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the problem statement.
Okay. Tell me more about the landmines that you're seeing usually.
Yeah, so a good question around landmines. And we were talking earlier about how companies typically overinvest in technology and they underinvest in the data and the processes and the infrastructure that they have already. And so the biggest landmine is really being very thoughtful about the productivity implications of those processes and data on the people and the investments. So oftentimes the company has it flipped around where they're like, okay, just going to buy this technology and, people will deal with it. And they're not trained. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. And none of their processes are in place. So the biggest landmine really is expectation setting around what processes need to be put in place and why. And that helps a business scale more rapidly. And again, we'll get into my background in a moment, but I've scaled as an operator businesses from 2 to 50, from 50 to 200, from 500 to 600 million. So I've been in various scaling operations, and you've got to have those processes and data in place. Otherwise, it's just going to be a productivity drag on everyone.
Yeah. So tell me about, what did that new sales process or sales journey look like?
Yeah. So a good analogy would be one where the salesperson was kind of a Beat Street cop and where it was turned into a private detective. So instead of the transaction of a Beat Street cop making the Beat Street arrest, you're now synthesizing data and insights on an account as opposed to a person, which is more transactional. You're looking at all the information across the account and making an assessment as to, is this account in market? Are they worth us pursuing? If they are worth us pursuing, what are the insights that we can see across everybody in the account that we can then prospect into the account with some level of success or confidence that they have interest in our solution? It's a hell of a lot of work to get from point A to point B with or without an external agency. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies are moving in this direction now because the number of buyers on the flip side, the buying committee side is increasing in size. So the sales process is almost headed in this direction automatically. So companies either have to adapt to that or they're going to die if they don't, make this transition.
Yeah. It's interesting that signals showing intent by individuals or companies. I've always been fascinated with that, specifically as it relates to like what I'll just refer to as false flags. Like, so events can happen that might seem really good, but they're false flags, right? Or you have data on a company that shows, hey, we're not seeing anything, meaning they're not in market, they're not ready to buy, so let's not go after this person, but maybe they are. And whether that's, sometimes it's as simple as like the IP data, like they go home at night on their personal computer and they're searching for things, right? So like,
Yep.
how do you navigate a world that the data is telling you one story and you want to have conviction in that data, but you know that it's not perfect?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. And that too is a common landmine of this process. And, if there were a silver bullet here of just getting revenue in the door, nobody would be listening to the podcast and we wouldn't be doing the podcast. But what I've seen in this particular case work is going again back to the process side. If I'm hearing you right, you're kind of saying, hey, what about these false indications? Like, what do I do with this information? And like, how do I treat this information, or how do I know what's good or what's not good? Let me make sure I got that question right.
Yeah. I mean, so the data might say things that you think, yes, this is what we want to see in the data. Do you validate it? Do you not? And when the data isn't saying anything, what do you do about it? Collect it, or do you ignore it?
So you nailed it. You should be in my shoes here. Maybe we'll hire you afterward. But the validation is the key part. So there's no technology, and no technology is probably a strong way of saying it, but there's very few technologies that will present you a qualified opportunity. There has to be some level of manual inspection, kind of a red face test of, hey, does this data really make sense? That's the first part of validation. And then the second part is really, it's prioritizing the efforts of the outbound outreach. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's more of a needs of validation to determine whether or not this account is actually in market. Are these signals really telling us the truth? So there's kind of a two-step process. One is introspective to the company. The other one is a little bit more of the prioritizing who you outreach to, and then kind of validating the information as part of that process. So you're not taking anything as carte blanche as, hey, this data has told us this, therefore we should go do that. We're not at that point in our evolution. And I don't know if we'll ever be at that point with the way privacy and data laws are going right now. I can't imagine we ever will reach that.
Yeah.
But we have a heck of a lot more insights than we did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago than we do today. So yeah, that's how I would probably approach that.
Yeah. I think it's also a good lesson that is such the role of the salesperson in this process, is to, the marketers arm them with the intelligence, but they need to then continue that up. So they can go into a conversation informed, but they still have to, validate that, ask new questions. So it's definitely a 1-2 punch. So my final question on this case is, again, the timing. How long did this take before everything kind of migrated to that new philosophy?
Yeah, great question. And this too was a process. So this was more of a 6 to 12 month process, mainly because they didn't have an account-based platform in place. They didn't have any of the processes in place. We shepherded them through a lot of those processes. And then as they made their decision on a platform, we helped kind of jumpstart that process, particularly with what's called the SDRs or the BDRs, which is kind of one step removed from the actual outreach of the sales rep. They're more the qualification function. We spent a lot of time training them up and getting them up to speed and really getting best practice insights and reporting to and through them. So that was probably more of a 6 to 12 month process. And again, a SaaS company that was growing relatively quickly. And yeah, I'd say about a 6 to 12 month process.
Okay, awesome. All right, we're going to jump into the second part of the podcast where we get to know you a little bit better. So tell us about the moment you accepted your first job. Were you all in saying, I've been dreaming of this forever? Or as many of our previous guests, it's kind of like, this just happened and I made a career out of it?
Yeah, gosh, I've had a really unique path. So if you're asking about my first marketing job, I was actually an officer in the service. I was an Army officer and on active duty. And so I had kind of a twin challenge of leaving active duty service and finding a commercial job. It just so happened that I was stationed out and around Silicon Valley. And I had found a terrific opportunity that was really kind of the mesh of my unique background of a finance undergrad, which very few marketers in my experience have. So I'm a little bit more quantitative than most, but it was really a finance undergrad, and it leveraged my experience that I built in the service as a telecommunications officer. It was in a telecom company doing pricing, and I worked for the head of sales / marketing. So it was a really perfect role for me coming right out of the service. And unlike a lot of other people in the service that I've noticed, I think because I literally left the service on a Friday and I started my job on a Monday, there wasn't a lot of time to worry about the identity change, because that can be fairly significant, like a professional athlete who changes from being a pro athlete to not a pro athlete. Leaving the military is no different, I think, as an analogy. But I didn't have a lot of time to really think about that because I literally left the service and I was working on the commercial front in Silicon Valley, and I got a front row seat to a lot of exciting things. So it really worked out well for me looking back in retrospect.
Yeah. What are some things that, I always look back at my career and it's like, my God, we're so sophisticated today, but going back 20 some years, it just was like a lot of things were just easier, like slower to create stuff, but easier because of the lack of chaos and the lack of keeping up with tech. I mean, are there things that you really enjoyed in that first role that wouldn't happen today just because it is such a different world that we live in?
Ooh, I'd say the biggest difference would be, oh God, there's so many differences as I think back, but back then you really didn't have a lot of the tools at your fingertips to do more of the thought leadership and branding and kind of putting yourself out there as an individual as you do today. So I think it was in that regard, it was less complicated, but now you have more opportunity to reach a broader audience quicker at a younger point in your career than perhaps when I eventually reached that a little bit later on down the road. Now you have the ability to reach to anybody. So that the tool of just, webcast and podcast may sound silly, but really didn't exist back when I made that first transition.
Yeah.
So, a Jon Russo would be unknown except for the people in Silicon Valley and the people that he worked with. So you really had to work hard on your reputation. But you really didn't think about, what was the rest of the world thinking. You didn't have Slack communities to compare and contrast, your thought leadership views with. So that too has changed quite a bit. I think for the most part, things have changed for the better, but you've got a lot more tools and capabilities at your fingertips today that you never had back then.
Yeah, I agree. I would never want to give away my tools. Like the power that I have as an individual today, it's obscene how much power you have with access to this stuff. There's one thing though that I always miss. I started my first job after I graduated in 96 and I was doing, commercial printing. So like we need an annual report or media buying. We're going to buy 3 months, 6 months of media. What I really miss about those days is the rallying point of a decision being made. And my example is you physically were on press printing something and everyone rallied because they said, look, we're printing it. You cannot, if you change your mind in 12 hours, you've just wasted $1 million of ink and paper or, the media campaign. Like if you go and change the buy, you're losing the negotiated rate. So it really was that moment where you made that big decision and you could literally sleep the next day because you're like, oh my God, you can't go back on it. And of course, today, it's all about iteration. You may launch a campaign and then all of a sudden it doesn't test well with, an awareness of a service line or something. So all of a sudden, what do? All right, we're phase 2ing it. We need more content that helps people understand what we're doing here. So I do miss those days of you could go an entire year as a marketer and make maybe 3 or 4 big decisions, and that was it.
Yeah. That actually also reminds me of a printing story, funny enough, with the second company right after I left that first one. We were about to go public, and we were at the very last stage of going public. We were about to, quote unquote, have the reds printed, which is the very last step. And it's like a big deal, really big deal when you're going public, because it kind of formalizes at that time, it formalizes your commitment to the public market that, you are going public. And then we had a company swoop in and buy us. So it all worked out fine, but the printing never happened. But I can relate to that very topic that you talked about right around that same time period, in fact, too. So I can totally relate to what you're saying there.
I'm going to accelerate the conversation 40 years from 1996. So this hasn't happened yet, but we've been talking a lot about tools, and obviously what you're doing involves a lot of tools to understand measurement. Have a look 5-10 years from now. What do you see as being possible today that we're just kind of we know it may get there, but in 5 to 10 years, it will just be the way that we operate, and it won't even be new and exciting because it's just part of what we do?
Yeah, I think that what we experience today with Amazon, for example, in a business to consumer purchase, where your purchase is very easy, it's very tailored, you have near perfect information of how others have purchased the product from your peer group or your peer set. It's a little bit more of a simplistic model because typically an Amazon purchase is one-to-one, it's a transaction. And B2B obviously has many more people that are involved, but I feel like we're heading down that same path of the more customized, the more targeted, the easier it is to purchase, the higher probability of success. And that's where I could kind of see, B2B eventually being B2C-ish, when it comes time to a buying process. We're kind of already there in some regards, like you'll hear the term product-led growth or PLG, where consumers are purchasing a lot of their products online anyway. So there's a number of SaaS companies that do that today that you can just easily purchase.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to start really feeling that here in the next few years, because if it's not personalized, it's just not going to be an experience that a buyer is going to really want to engage with.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave you with an analogy on that. It's kind of the situation of my television set at home. I've got access to 700 channels. I watch the same 7. I don't have a need to go to anything else because the 7 that I watch are very tailored to my interests. And I think it's the same thing. People will have a lot of choice, but ultimately they're going to turn to the same 7 or 8 choices because it fits their needs. That's what I think will happen with B2B.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. I can relate to the channel thing. It reminds me of the Bruce Springsteen song. What is it? Reference to 57 channels, but nothing's on, right? That was obscene back in the day, like 57 channels. You don't need 57, but he should update that. A friend of mine just went to a Bruce Springsteen concert, and he should update that to 700 channels and nothing on. Awesome. Well, Jon, I really enjoyed the conversation today. Thanks for sharing both case studies, and I can relate to your stories about what it was like back in the late 90s doing work. A whole lot different, but also today, it can't get more exciting today. I mean, AI is kind of just starting to like get some traction, not in the cheesy way where everyone's talking about AI this and AI that. Like if you look at the fundamentals of what that can do and the implications for ways that we gather and analyze information, I go crazy over that stuff because it's like every couple days I'm in that world, I feel like I discover a new application, and it just, I always find myself looking back at myself as a marketer and just being like, you silly marketer, like you thought you knew what you were doing a year ago, 10 years ago, and it's just a whole nother level. And that is what really gets me excited.
Yeah, and I think to your point, where AI intersects with that personalization, that's exactly the intersection. Like AI to me is the delivery vehicle to get to that personalized experience. You no longer have to be maybe an expert in the field. You can rely on AI to get you the personalized content, to give you the personalized experience for your buyer. So I see like AI as a means to an end, but it's going to accelerate by leaps and bounds for marketers that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we'd throw people at it. Those days are done.
Yeah.
It'll all be automation and it'll be personalized. So that's the key thing is it's going to be hyper relevant.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Jon. Some homework for the listeners. If you've made it this far in the podcast, it means that you've enjoyed it today, which means that you should now share it with someone. So if you have anyone that you think is a B2B marketer that you want to say, hey, I listened to this show the other day. It was pretty good. Have a listen. I would appreciate that. So again, thank you, Jon. And thank you everyone for joining us today on Interesting B2B Marketers. Take care.
Thanks again, Steve.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.